feeling? Good? Energy still up? This is kind of the time of day where I'm ready for a nap as well. Creative stimulation, right? Okay, well, this is us. My name is Kiran Rana. I am the manager of content and podcast strategy in the Globe Content Studio. I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up of what we're doing today, right? Like, you know, when we're thinking about audio, how many of you listen to podcasts? As expected, very yes. I hope the three of us up here listen. You know, there's such a saturation. There's so much out there, and it's a real opportunity not only to see what you like and what you're interested in, but also for us as creators, what inspires us, what we can learn from it. And it's not just learnings for audio alone. I think a lot of these lessons transfer for marketers across across mediums, across styles, all of those things. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to each of our panelists to just introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about who they are and what they do at the Globe. Kasia.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kasia Mychajlowycz. I'm the special projects producer, which means I made 2 seasons of In Her Defense, and I contribute to The Decibel.
That brings me in. I'm Adrian Cheung. I'm the senior producer of The Decibel. That's our daily news podcast here at the Globe, Monday through Friday. The promise is sort of 20 to 25 minutes of the biggest news story that we can cover.
Hey everybody, my name is Fulton. I'm also a podcast producer at the Globe and Mail. I work mostly within the Globe Content Studio, so the 3 shows on the left there, or I guess you're right, are the ones that I work on mostly. There's Stress Test, that's our personal finance podcast. City Space, which is kind of an urban planning and design podcast. And then Happy Enough, which is a new show that we launched just a few months ago, which is a show sort of about the science and philosophy around happiness. So yeah, I work mostly within the content studio environment, but I'm kind of a podcast producer at large within the Globe.
All right. So what we're doing today is we're going to talk a little bit about the shows that are inspiring us from the last year. Kasia, let's start with you. When we started talking about this panel, the ones you pointed out, you called them weird niche shows.
Yeah.
So tell me, what makes them weird and niche, and why do you gravitate towards them?
Well, I gravitate towards them because I've been making podcasts for like 15 years, so you have to really grab my attention these days. If we're following kind of something that's rote, then I'm not interested. And more as bigger and bigger companies get into the game of podcasting, I've been finding more and more shows for everybody, which to me means shows for nobody. There are very few shows that are going to be able to have this very, very broad appeal and still like have the juice for me. So these shows they usually play with the form in some way. They have a conceit that they follow through to their sometimes ridiculous conclusions, and they are also pretty production intense, so they sound good to me, which is also very important to me. The takeaway from that for me is that I always think of making a show that's for a certain person. It can be accessible, and it can appeal to a large group of people, but when you're making something and you're trying to get into someone's little ear while they're doing the dishes, putting kids to bed. I've heard people are doing lots of things when listening to it. They want to be spoken to very directly. And we have I think of a certain listener to be able to know what would this person know about this topic? What do I have to go over for them to understand? What is going to be exciting to them? And for In Her Defense, for example, it's a true crime podcast, and it's focused on women in the justice system. I'm thinking of, and the research bears this out, most of our listeners are women. And so they have an interest in the show that might be a little bit different than others. So when I think of where does this show need to go? What does this show need to explain? I think of a female listener. And sometimes that means that there's stuff I don't need to explain to her, and there's stuff about the justice system that I might have to explain to her. And that helps bring a specificity that I think even if you are not actually the person who is being considered when the show is being made, if you don't fit that demographic for whatever reason, you appreciate the authenticity of that. And just for an example, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative is a very weird show that has kind of a meta-narrative about storytelling itself. And it was labor of love, and it was a kind of a hard thing to make, and there are a lot of cringy moments, but it brings a kind of reality to it that I found super addictive. And as a result, it won a lot of awards, and it got a lot more play than like an indie podcast that was trying to reach as many people as possible might have done without that specificity.
So your thing is like pay attention to what you're trying to do. Don't worry if it's niche. Don't worry, like that's a good thing in your mind.
I think that is a
Yeah.
good thing. Like, haven't we all seen how like weird niche things get elevated and go viral just because some people are craving something new and authentic? And I think that has a better shot, especially if you have like limited resources, to try to make something that's like, oh, I'll make another chat show and I'll be like Joe Rogan. You won't. That's happened. All of those people are taken up. Or The Daily, or like in a news show like The Decibel, they are trying to inform as many people as possible. And that is what they're setting out to do. But if you're making a show about a specialty area, or like In Her Defense, which is like kind of a feminist Canadian true crime show, think specifically who you're really speaking to.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about In Her Defense and balancing, right? Like thinking in terms of the audience. Tell us a little bit about that process. What did it look like to make a show that's more narrative in structure, reported in a very specific viewpoint? Can you walk us through that a little?
Yeah. It's laborious and it takes a long time, but it's so rewarding. I was working with Jana Pruden, who's a feature reporter here at the Globe and Mail, and our first season is about a farm woman who goes to prison for marrying her husband. But then a bunch of feminist lawyers find out about this, and the quest is to make her free because she was supposed to have used this defense called the battered women's defense. Now, our listeners might really understand, have learned a lot about toxicity in relationships. Domestic violence, family violence is sadly very prevalent. Maybe they know a lot about that, but they're not going to know a lot about the battered women defense or the history about that, but they're definitely interested in it. And at the end of the show, here's an example of something that we kind of had discussions over, let's say, Jan and I with our editors, and all of our editors were men, and they kind of didn't want this last bit. There's like a little epilogue at the end of the season that's about Helen, who's the woman who was convicted of murder. She's out, spoiler alert, and she has a party, and she invites our host, Jana, to come to the party, but not as a reporter. We can't record this. She wants her to come as a friend. And we thought that's a perfect way to end the show, because we show that Helen is now free to make her own decisions, to say no, to dictate the terms of this relationship. And it was a little quirky, and our editors were worried about that. Like, is this going to resonate with anybody? Is people going to see that? And I have to say, people who listened all the way to the end, so many people emailed us, and they were like, I love that moment where Helen is finally super free, and she says no, and learn to say no, which I think is something that especially women can relate to, learning to have boundaries and enforce them, but at the same time, it's still entertaining for everybody to listen to. So that's an example of that.
I'm going to pivot to Adrian, who's having a very calm, easy week, month, year.
Yeah.
No, the world is good.
No news.
Really good right now.
So, Adrian, Kasia talks a lot about the specificity of a show, how, really knowing how to distill down to what you're good at, right, and telling your story. You are the senior producer of The Decibel, which is in a very saturated category, right? There's a lot of news podcasts. So how do you use those similar kinds of takeaways when you're thinking about how you make a news show that stands out?
Yeah, I mean, Kasia just said something that really resonates with me, which is you can't be everything to everybody, because then you end up being nothing to everybody, basically. For me, one of the big things is really learning to lean into your strengths of the newsroom that we have specifically, and that informs everything else that we do, from how long the episodes are, who our guests are, what types of stories that we cover, and by its very nature, when you make a daily news podcast, you are kind of trying to be a little bit of everything to everybody, because we are general news. This is not a specialist podcast. So we are trying to reach a very wide audience, but we do have to be very specific in the types of stories that we want to tell. And to me, one of the guiding principles is essentially, what is your promise to the audience? And you can only really establish through doing this every single day in the daily news space, that you are clearly communicating to people what this specific episode is about, but also what you can depend on us for. So one of our big sells is essentially that you will get to know one big story per day, 25 minutes or less. That's the promise. And I'm militant about that 25 minutes. Because both from a storytelling perspective, I think it helps your audience when you are very specific and trying to be concise and focused. But also, we have seen listenership data that it does tail off after 25 minutes, because it's a much easier sell to all of you if you're on a commute and you have 30 minutes and you're like, well, I get to learn about something over 25 minutes. That's a pretty easy sell, versus something can be the most interesting story ever, but if it's 45 minutes or it's an hour, that's a big time investment for you. And so, we have seen that reflected back to us in the listenership data. So that's sort of the logistical part of it. But then also in terms of leaning into strengths, we know where we excel, both from our production team, but also the Globe newsroom at large, is we excel at Canadian news, Canadian politics, and business and economics, right? So why reinvent the wheel when we have some of the best reporters in the country doing those things and leveraging their experience, their knowledge, and their ability in front of the mic? And so we are very specific about the types of stories that we cover, where it's about analysis, it's about depth. We're trying to explain the why in a story. So it's not good enough for us to cover something just because something happened. We want to be able to explain the context behind things, maybe certain details that a reporter wasn't able to tell in their written piece. And so we cover everything, but we tend to focus on those kinds of episodes and that kind of reporting. As a result, that sort of dictates what we're doing right now with election. I'm going to plug a little bit. In the previous slide, there was a campaign call. We're doing a panel every single Friday during the election period, and that is a chance for us to focus on what's happening in the campaign, a panel type show, and because we really want to lean into both what our audience tells us that they want to listen to, but also what we're good at. So trying not to shy away from what we do well, rather than trying to branch out and do a bunch of different things for different people.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said about length, because I am also militant about length. Kyle knows this. This is something that I'm always thinking about, but it's also something that we think about not just in audio form, but I think anyone here who works as a marketer knows, we have these time spent metrics, we have these engagement metrics, and often if you're going a lot longer, right, who is that serving? Is that serving you as the producer, or is it serving you as the audience, right? And if you're being audience centric, how much time do they have, whether they're reading something, they're watching something, or they're listening to something? So as you mentioned, you're thinking about the commute. Most people are listening when they're commuting. Some people or a lot of people you're finding are listening when they're doing some sort of chore or an activity, right? And how much time do they have, and how can they fully enjoy that? You mentioned campaign call and leveraging what you're good at and leveraging that space. So I'm going to turn it to Kyle, whose takeaway is all about leveraging what you have. So the shows that you've kind of pointed out are the ones doing that?
Yeah. I spend a lot of time thinking about the right type of formats for shows, and one of the conversations I have with people, especially when they're starting new podcasts, is what should my format be? Should I be an always-on type of podcast where every Tuesday for an indeterminate period of time I'm going to put out? Sorry?
Forever.
Forever, yeah, exactly. And I think that when people think about really popular podcasts, the vast majority of them are on that always-on type of model. Now that type of model is also very intimidating, it's very laborious, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of resources. So one thing that we're always, I wouldn't say pushing, but kind of, helping people sort of understand is the value of these short form series where you commit to a season of shows. It could be 6 episodes, it could be 20 episodes, but sort of having an arc of a season and then moving on from there. One of the things that's tough about that format, though, is podcasts are generally a bit of a slow burn. There are sensational podcasts that take off right from the beginning, but for the most part, these shows are taking a while to build an audience, to find their voice, and really to kind of connect with an audience. And most of the shows that I work on at the Globe are these short form shows. So how do you make something that you're proud of, but also at the same time find an audience quickly? And one thing that has kind of stood out to me in the last year and a couple of the shows I wanted to highlight were people that developed short form series through an existing audience and kind of spun them off from an existing show. This kind of dovetails a bit into Adrian's point about doing a politics show, but doing it through the Decibel, where you have this kind of committed audience, an audience where they're interested in this content and they've been looking for it. So 2 of the shows that stood out to me this year, one of them I thought was really interesting. I'm not sure if there's any 99% Invisible fans here in the audience. A couple? Very cool. Awesome. So they did something. This is actually in 2004, so it's I'm a little bit off the trend. But they did a kind of a book club podcast where they read this kind of notoriously long and thorough biography called The Power Broker, which if anybody knows Robert Caro, he's kind of a famous biographer. He's written about 10,000 pages on LBJ at this point, but he did this very sort of kind of notorious biography of Robert Moses, who was the great city builder from New York City in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And it's kind of seen as this very, very dense book. It's celebrated, but it's a real tome. It's a huge book. And so they decided to do a book club where they were going to read The Power Broker, and every month they would read maybe 10 more chapters, and then they'd talk about it with a guest. And those guests were people like Conan O'Brien and Peter Buttigieg and AOC. It was a really great slate. But it was only 10 episodes, and I thought they did a really nice job of spinning this off of an existing audience where they knew they had people that were interested in city building and public policy and architecture, and using that as a way to really hit the ground running with this short-term series. Another one that stood out to me, and this one was a little more oddball, but I thought it worked really, really well, was Bowen Yang and Matt Rogers, who do a very successful culture podcast, and Bowen Yang's well known for being on SNL, obviously. They did an Olympics podcast last year. Now, the Olympics are even more of a bit of a time crunch, because not only are you doing a limited series, but you're doing a limited series that's tied to a very specific moment in time. Nobody's really going to care about dissecting the Olympics, a month after they happen, let alone even a couple days after they happen. So you need to build this audience very, very quickly, and I thought they did a nice job of taking a brand that they knew had a big following behind it, 2 hosts that they knew were friends and had amazing chemistry, because that's one of the hardest things to build on a show. And maybe covering sports wasn't necessarily their expertise, but I found that, going this route where you're saying this might not be the traditional host for this topic, but saying we're looking for chemistry and we're looking for an audience and we're prioritizing that over sort of a natural fit for covering this topic, I thought was a really interesting idea. So those were 2 shows that I thought did a nice job of leveraging a devoted audience and trying something different at the same time.
Very cool. Yeah. I think that's something that we're all trying to do as well in our respective Globe ecosystem, right? Leveraging the feeds that we have, figuring out ways that our audiences can kind of interconnect, where they make sense, where they don't, right? I want to ask, we're almost down. We've got this red timer clock.
It's so big.
It's very glaring, and it's saying 42 seconds, but really rapid fire. I want to ask each of you what you think the biggest misconception is around audio, specifically, from a brand and marketing standpoint? Like what do you think people get wrong about audio?
That true crime is a bummer for people. It's not. It's entertainment. It's not something that you should be afraid of advertising against. In fact, it has an incredibly engaged and desirable audience.
Adrian?
Biggest misconception in audio that you just set up 2 mics and have people talk. That's it. I don't know how other shows are created, but all the ones that I've worked on require hours of preparation, research, really thinking about the format and the structure of the show. So a lot goes into it. Yeah.
I think I would say that if your show doesn't have an audience after the first 2 or 3 episodes, that it's never going to find one. I've seen a lot, like we said, these things are a slow burn sometimes, and it really does it takes time to find your voice. So I would say have a bit of patience, listen to your audience. It's not to say to be stubborn, but do have patience when developing a new show. And if it's something that you like, trust that it will find that audience eventually.
Awesome. Thank you, 3. I think we're going to turn it over to questions. If anyone has any, we've got a nice throw mic here. Any questions over here?
I do like the microphone. Because so much of content and content strategy is visual and video, I think I recognize, or some of us recognize, the podcast by the cover art, but that doesn't always translate into the content and the way it's shown on social. So what are your, recommendations, or what have you seen podcasts do to really promote their work on social, as opposed to just, a still of the cover art or clips of the studio that look the same every time they're shared?
Yeah.
I've never really seen great conversion rates from social for any show I've worked on in the past 15 years. So, and that's, probably a dozen shows with all my freelancing. That is so difficult. The way that podcasts grow is through word of mouth and in-app placement. And that can be hard because we have these social media channels and we want to connect with people. And I think there is some forays into short video that's specific and separate from the podcast. I see a lot of interest in video podcasts, and having lived through the pivot to video of 2016, I have my reservations about how that's all going to pan out. But I saw something today on LinkedIn. As you know, I love LinkedIn. But I did see something on there that's the one rule for podcasts, if you're going to do any kind of videos, don't make it worse. And that can happen because they're just 2 completely different skill sets. So I am interested in video and TikToks for social media, but I think it's about trying to reach people in other audio mediums. The cross promotion is also a huge way. And in a way, it is socialized media, as in it is about people just sharing episodes with each other or finding things through feed swaps, and that shows you that the person's already in the app, they're ready, they're poised for a podcast, whereas asking someone to click a link, find their podcast app, go to a different app, and then just change modes and start listening to a podcast is such a big ask.
Contrarian viewpoint.
I
feel like while you can't mark the conversion rate on social because it's harder to see, I know I have an awareness play from seeing a clip of something.
That's true.
So you see something, you're not going, okay, I must click out and find it right now, but it kind of jogs my memory to say, okay, I saw this really interesting clip on a reel of Ellen Pompeo talking to, I don't even know who she was, but I'm sure many people have seen it recently, of her talking about motherhood and how motherhood split her on Grey's Anatomy. It went everywhere. And it was that clip, you're like, oh, where did she say this thing? What show was that on? How do I get to listen to that if I'm interested in that topic? The key there, though, to me is that, sorry, I'm hitting my mic. The key to me there is that you have to kind of already be interested in the topic. Yeah. Whereas I see what Kasia's saying about referral, right? Word of mouth, you trust a person more than you would trust a random person on the internet.
It's
or
so tricky.
A brand.
Although that did happen to me with Giggly Squad.
Yeah.
I didn't know who any of those people were. I don't watch reality TV, but I saw enough social media clips of it that I was like, all right, who are these funny people?
Any other questions? Yep.
Hi there, my name is Fumi. I used to work at places like Fulton TV where we started our own in-house podcast. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, when is it worth it for a brand to start their own podcast versus maybe just sponsoring one or like being a co-partner in one that already exists?
Yeah.
Yeah, I from my point of view, because I do work with quite a few brands on this, I think it's thinking about, do you have a specific story to tell that you could tell better than anyone else? Or at least, you have something original to say. I don't think most people listen to podcasts because of the brand. No one says, I love this brand, so I'm interested in their podcast. I think what they'll say is, this sounds like an interesting story. So I think thinking about it story first and kind of going from there. If you're saying, we want to get into the podcast game, but we're not necessarily sure if we have something to offer that no one else can do, that might be a better move to do kind of a more traditional sponsorship side. But if you have that story that you think is original to you and your brand, then that would be where I would look to do that sort of thing in-house.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the panel here?
I do think you should consider sponsoring a podcast because it takes a long time to get the kind of story together that's going to make an enduring podcast. And there are so many shows out there. And one thing to think about the niche shows is that you don't have to spend $1 million on getting onto the biggest show you can think of, right? Like the small shows that have those dedicated audiences have very reasonable rates for advertising and are really excited about it. A lot of them will do host read, some won't, but they have listen through rates, which we talked about a little bit, like average consumption rates that are really high. Like I know that all of our podcasts enjoy really high listen-through rates, which is very rare in the industry. Usually it's like 50%, but the first season of Interdefense was literally 100%. Like everyone who click play, they listen to the whole thing. And that means they're hitting every ad break and they're listening through all of it. So I think that that's another thing to consider. I love making podcasts. I understand why would be really interesting. And if you do have that unique story and unique access that maybe journalists don't have, then go for it. And if not, you can find something definitely within your price range that is going to hit people. And people love when you support the podcast that they love. I know this. I buy all the stuff.
No, that's great points from both Kyle and Kasia. Definitely around the idea of having a story to tell, and also maybe having the people in play. Like if you're thinking about it, of having people who work in audio and know the space, because I think we've all listened to like branded podcasts where you're a little bit like, what is this? Like what are like, it's just like kind of two people meandering and having a conversation, but like talking around something, and you don't, it's like, I think you need somebody who has a very clear idea, again, about what the show is going to be, and then you can find an audience. But otherwise, I think another great way is through sponsorship and feeling like if a show aligns with what the brand is and like sort of the sort of message that you want to connect with, then that's a great partnership.
I think that's all the time we have.